Stand with me, if you will, on the banks of the Nile some 5,000 years ago. The river stretches before us, a ribbon of life cutting through an ocean of sand. This is not merely water flowing to the sea. This is the heartbeat of civilization itself, pulsing with possibility. In the beginning, there were only villages, scattered communities of farmers and fishermen, each cluster of reed houses clinging to the river's edge like children to their mother. They planted barley when the floodwaters receded. They caught fish in woven traps. They buried their dead in the sand, facing west toward the setting sun. Simple people, living simple lives, with no notion that their descendants would build monuments to outlast empires. But something extraordinary was stirring in the human heart. Ambition, vision, the audacious idea that scattered tribes might become something greater. Consider the challenge they faced. Egypt stretches for nearly 700 miles along the Nile's course, from the Mediterranean marshes in the north to the granite cliffs of the First Cataract in the south. Two lands, really. Lower Egypt in the delta, where the river splinters into countless channels and the soil is black and rich. Upper Egypt in the south, a narrow corridor hemmed by desert cliffs, where the river runs singular and strong, different peoples, different traditions, different gods watching over different stretches of the sacred river. To unite them would require more than military might. It would demand a vision so compelling, a will so absolute, that it could bend the course of human history. The name that echoes across the millennia is Narmer, though we must speak carefully here, for the line between history and legend blurs in these distant days. Some call him Menes. Others say these were two men, or that the legends conflate multiple rulers into one heroic figure. But the story that survived speaks of a warrior king from the south, from the city of Hierakonpolis, where the falcon god Horus was supreme. Picture him in your mind. A man of ruthless ambition and strategic brilliance, commanding armies when warfare was still fought with copper weapons and stone maces. He gazed north along the Nile and saw not separate kingdoms but a single realm waiting to be forged, one Egypt, one crown, one eternal dynasty stretching into forever. The unification battles must have been brutal affairs. Reed boats carrying warriors down the river, armies clashing on the muddy banks, cities surrounded, their defenders starving behind walls of mud brick. The archaeological record preserves images of victory on a ceremonial palette carved in slate. We see Narmer wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, his mace raised to strike a kneeling captive. On the reverse he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, striding among the decapitated bodies of his enemies. Warfare, yes, but also something more profound was happening. Narmer was creating theatre. He was crafting symbols that would endure. The double crown, the Hedjet white, and the Deshret red, united atop one royal head. It was a statement written in stone and blood. These two lands are now one, and where better to establish the capital of this unified kingdom than at the very junction between north and south? Memphis rose at the apex of the delta, where Upper Egypt met Lower Egypt, a city positioned with strategic genius. From here, a king could project power in both directions. From here, the bureaucrats and scribes who would administer this vast realm could coordinate the collection of grain, the conscription of workers, the management of an entire civilization. Think about what was required to govern such a territory with the technology of 5,000 years ago. No telephones, no postal service, no rapid transport. Messages travelled at the speed of a man walking, or at best, a boat sailing with favourable wind. To maintain control over hundreds of miles demanded innovations in administration that were as revolutionary as any military conquest. The early pharaohs developed a system of provincial governors, nomarchs who ruled over the administrative districts we call nomes. They created a literate class of scribes who could record grain harvests, census data, and royal decrees in the beautiful hieroglyphic script. They established a calendar, based on the Nile's flooding cycles, dividing the year into 3 seasons: Akhet, the inundation; Peret, the growing season; and Shemu, the harvest. But most audaciously of all, they declared themselves divine. This was not mere political theatre, though it certainly served political purposes. The pharaoh was Horus incarnate, the living god who maintained cosmic order against the forces of chaos. When he ruled justly, when he performed the proper rituals, when he built temples and made offerings, then Ma'at prevailed. Ma'at, that untranslatable concept encompassing truth, justice, harmony, and balance, the very foundation upon which creation rested. Without the pharaoh, the Egyptians believed, the sun might not rise, the Nile might not flood, chaos might overwhelm creation itself. It was a brilliant ideological innovation. Kings who rule by divine right can demand absolute obedience, but it also imposed tremendous responsibility. The pharaoh must be perfect, must be tireless, must stand as the intermediary between humanity and the gods, bearing the weight of cosmic order on royal shoulders. The early rulers wrestled order from chaos in practical ways as well. They organized massive irrigation projects, extending canals to bring Nile water to previously barren land. More fields meant more grain meant more people could be fed, more people meant more workers for royal projects. A virtuous cycle, building momentum across generations. They established trade networks that reached far beyond Egypt's borders. Cedar from Lebanon for shipbuilding and construction, copper from Sinai, gold from Nubia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, traveling through countless intermediaries to reach the workshops of Memphis. The pharaohs were creating not just a kingdom but a nexus of commerce, drawing the wealth of the known world toward the Nile. And they built monuments. The earliest royal tombs at Abydos and Saqqara were mastabas, low rectangular structures of mud brick, impressive by contemporary standards, certainly larger than anything a commoner might possess, but still essentially elaborate houses for the dead. Yet even in these early monuments, we see the seeds of what would come. Burial chambers stocked with furniture, food, jewelry, weapons, everything a king might need in the afterlife. Because death was not an ending for the ancient Egyptians. It was a transformation, a dangerous journey that could lead to eternal life if one possessed the proper knowledge, the proper spells, the proper provisions. The pharaoh would die, but he would also be reborn among the stars, sailing across the heavens with Ra in the solar boat, ruling the afterlife as he had ruled Egypt. This belief system would drive the civilization's greatest achievements and strangest obsessions. It would lead to the development of mummification, that astonishing technique of preserving the body against decay. It would inspire the creation of elaborate funerary texts, magic spells inscribed on tomb walls to guide and protect the deceased. And ultimately, it would lead to the pyramids, those mountains of stone that still dominate the Giza Plateau, visible from space, defying entropy itself. But we are still in the early days. The second and third generations after Narmer consolidated what the founder had won through conquest. They established the patterns of kingship that would persist for 3,000 years. The royal titulary, with its 5 great names. The Sed festival, celebrated after 30 years of rule, in which the aging pharaoh would ritually prove his vitality by running between markers. The intimate connection between kingship and the gods, particularly Horus and later Osiris, the god who died and was reborn. King Jer, one of Narmer's successors, left us evidence of his power in the form of a massive tomb at Abydos. Excavators found not just the royal burial chamber but hundreds of subsidiary graves surrounding it, hundreds of retainers, sacrificed to serve their king in death as they had in life. A grim practice that speaks to both the pharaoh's authority and the belief that the afterlife would mirror the structure of earthly existence. Later dynasties would abandon human sacrifice, substituting servant statues called shabtis. But in these raw early centuries, The divine king's power over life and death was absolute and terrifying. By the reign of Den, fifth king of the first dynasty, Egyptian civilization had developed recognizable complexity. We have beautiful artifacts from his tomb, an ivory label showing him striking a fallen enemy, asserting dominance over chaotic foreign lands, stone vessels of exquisite craftsmanship, jewelry worked in gold and semi-precious stones, the products of specialized artisans who no longer needed to farm, supported instead by the agricultural surplus that centralized government made possible. Den also left us something more precious than gold-written records. Brief inscriptions, yes, but evidence of an administration that was learning to document its activities, recording deliveries of oil and grain, tracking the years by significant events. Year of the second count of cattle, or year of smiting the eastern nomads. The mechanisms of bureaucratic control that would allow Egypt to function as a unified state for millennia were being invented, perfected, passed down. The second dynasty brought internal strife, civil war, it seems, between factions supporting different royal lines. The unity Narmer had forged nearly fractured, but it held, testament to the strength of the institutions that had been created. By the end of the second dynasty, around 4,650 years ago, Egypt was poised on the threshold of its greatest age. The Old Kingdom was about to dawn. King Djoser would ascend the throne, and with him, an architect named Imhotep would revolutionize forever what humans believed possible. They would reach for the sky itself, raising the first pyramid, establishing a tradition of monumental building that would define Egyptian civilization and capture the imagination of every generation that followed. But that story, the Age of Pyramids, the ultimate expression of divine kingship, the monuments that would stand when every other achievement had turned to dust, that story awaits us next. For now, appreciate what these early kings accomplished. They took scattered villages and forged a nation. They created systems of government, writing, religion, and art that would persist longer than any other continuous civilization in human history. From the chaos of prehistory, they wrestled order. From mud and reeds beside a river, they built something eternal. The pharaohs had arrived, the kingdom was born, and Egypt would never be the same. Stand with me one more moment on these ancient banks. The Nile still flows as it did 5,000 years ago. Though the villages are gone, though the people who first witnessed the unification are dust, but their legacy surrounds us. In the very concept of a unified nation, in the idea that rulers could claim divine authority, in the notion that humans might build monuments to outlast time itself, they were the first. The pioneers who showed what human ambition, organization, and vision could achieve when focused with absolute determination. Every empire that followed, Assyrian, Persian, Greek, Roman, would look back to Egypt as the original, the template, the civilization that proved it could be done. The dawn had broken over the Nile Valley. The age of pharaohs had begun, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. There are moments in human history when ambition transcends all reasonable limits, when vision becomes so grand, so audacious, that it reshapes not just a civilization but the very landscape itself. The fourth dynasty of Egypt was such a moment. Imagine standing at Saqqara around 4,600 years ago. The desert plateau stretches before you, empty save for the ancient mastaba tombs of earlier kings. Then King Djoser arrives with his architect, a man named Imhotep, and they dare to ask a question that will change everything. What if we built upward? It seems simple now, doesn't it? Stack stone upon stone, reaching toward the heavens. But consider no one had done this before, not at this scale, not in stone that would last forever. The mud brick structures of the past crumbled and dissolved. Imhotep proposed something revolutionary, a stairway to the sky, built from limestone blocks, each weighing tons, fitted together with such precision that a knife blade could not slip between them. The step pyramid rose in stages, literally and figuratively. 6 massive tiers, each smaller than the one below, ascending to a height of 200 feet. At its base, a complex of temples, courtyards, and ceremonial spaces covering 40 acres. The entire precinct surrounded by a wall 30 feet high, with a single monumental entrance. This was not merely a tomb. It was a statement written in millions of tons of stone. The pharaoh is divine. The pharaoh is eternal. The pharaoh transcends death itself. Imhotep became more than an architect. He became legend. In later centuries, Egyptians would worship him as a god of wisdom and healing. They would say he invented stone architecture, though this oversimplifies what he truly achieved. He transformed possibility itself. He showed that human hands, directed by human will, could create monuments that would stand when empires fell, when languages died, when the very names of gods were forgotten. And he sparked an obsession that would consume Egypt for the next century. King Sneferu inherited this revolutionary idea and pushed it to extremes that nearly broke the kingdom. This pharaoh, who ruled for perhaps 24 years, built not one pyramid but 3 mountains of stone, each a massive experiment in engineering and ambition. The first, at Meidum, began as a step pyramid, but was later filled in to create smooth sides. The transformation was too ambitious, too rushed. The outer casing collapsed, perhaps during construction, perhaps centuries later. What remains is an eerie tower rising from a hill of rubble, a warning written in broken limestone about the dangers of overreach. But Sneferu did not abandon his vision. He simply tried again. At Dashur he began a new pyramid, even more ambitious. The angle was steep, 54 degrees, designed to soar dramatically toward the sky. Workers cut blocks from quarries, transported them across the desert, hauled them up ramps that grew longer with each new layer. Hundreds of men, thousands perhaps, laboring under the sun, serving their divine king. Then something went wrong. Perhaps the foundation shifted. Perhaps they noticed cracks in the lower chambers. Perhaps the architects calculated and realized their mistake. Halfway up, the angle changes abruptly to 43 degrees, creating the strange profile we call the bent pyramid, a monument to both ambition and the necessity of adapting when reality imposes its limits. Still, Sneferu persisted. A third pyramid, the Red Pyramid, also at Dashur. This time, the angle was conservative from the start, 43 degrees throughout. This time, the engineering was sound. This time, finally, Egypt had its first true smooth-sided pyramid, a template for everything that would follow. Consider what Sneferu accomplished in a single reign. He built more stone monuments than any pharaoh before or after, nearly 9 million tons of limestone and granite. The resources required strain, comprehension. The workers fed, housed, organized. The quarries opened, exploited, exhausted. The transport systems, boats and sledges and ramps, the planning, calculating angles, surveying sites, solving problems that had never been solved before. This was not slave labor, though that myth persists. Recent discoveries of workers' villages tell a different story. These were skilled craftsmen and seasonal laborers, peasants who worked on the pyramids when the Nile flood prevented farming. They were fed meat and bread, given beer rations, housed in organized barracks. They worked not because chains compelled them, but because their god-king commanded, and their religion promised that serving the pharaoh's eternal monument was sacred duty. They believed. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing. They believed that building these mountains of stone mattered not just for the pharaoh, but for Egypt, for cosmic order, for the very fabric of creation. And then came Khufu. The name still resonates across 45 centuries. Khufu, whom the Greeks called Cheops. Khufu, who gazed at his father Sneferu's achievements and thought, "I will surpass them all." The Great Pyramid at Giza is an achievement that defies casual comprehension. Stand before it, truly stand there, craning your neck to see the apex 45 stories above, and you feel something primal. Awe, wonder, a kind of vertigo at the scale of human ambition. 2,300,000 stone blocks, each averaging 2.5 tons. Some granite blocks in the internal chambers weigh 50 tons, transported 500 miles from Aswan quarries. The base covers 13 acres, level to within a fraction of an inch. The sides align almost perfectly to the cardinal directions north, south, east, west, a feat of astronomical observation and surveying that speaks to sophisticated knowledge. For 3,800 years, until medieval cathedrals rose in Europe, this was the tallest human-made structure on Earth. Think about that timeline. Cleopatra lived closer to our time than to the building of the Great Pyramid. When Roman tourists visited Giza, the pyramids were already more ancient to them than Roman ruins are to us. These monuments have outlasted not just their builders but entire civilizations, languages, religions, ways of life. How was it built? The question has spawned countless theories, some plausible, others veering into fantasy. The truth, as archaeology gradually reveals it, is simultaneously more mundane and more impressive than alien intervention or lost super technology. They used copper tools and stone hammers. They used geometry and simple machines, levers, rollers, ramps. They used organization on a scale never before attempted. Tens of thousands of workers coordinated across decades. Quarry teams cutting blocks to specification, transport teams moving them to the site, construction teams placing them with precision, support teams feeding and housing everyone. The limestone came from nearby quarries, where crews cut blocks following natural fissure lines, using copper saws and wooden wedges soaked in water that expanded to split the stone. The blocks were then loaded onto sledges, which teams of workers pulled across paths wetted to reduce friction. Recent experiments confirmed that wetting the sand dramatically reduces the force needed to move heavy loads. Ramps, likely a combination of straight ramps for the lower levels and spiral ramps wrapping around the structure as it rose, allowed workers to drag blocks into position. The final casing stones, finest quality limestone from Tura quarries across the Nile, were polished until the entire pyramid gleamed brilliant white in the desert sun, visible for miles in every direction. Inside, a marvel of engineering. The Grand Gallery, rising at a steep angle, corbelled walls converging toward the ceiling. The King's Chamber, with its massive granite beams forming a roof strong enough to support thousands of tons of stone above. The so-called relieving chambers, empty spaces above the King's Chamber, designed to distribute the weight, protecting the burial chamber from collapse. Every detail calculated, every element serving both practical function and symbolic meaning. The pyramid was more than a tomb, it was a machine for resurrection, an engine for transforming the mortal pharaoh into an eternal god. Khufu's architect, whose name is lost to us, was a genius equal to Imhotep, but Khufu himself earned a darker reputation. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing 2,000 years after the pyramid's construction, recorded legends that Khufu was a tyrant who enslaved his people, who prostituted his own daughter to raise funds for his monument. These stories tell us more about Greek attitudes than Egyptian reality, but they hint at a truth. Such monuments required sacrifice on a national scale. The Fourth Dynasty essentially bankrupted Egypt building pyramids. Resources that might have gone to temples, cities, infrastructure, all diverted to these eternal monuments. The kings who followed Khufu tried to match his achievement. His son Djedefre began a pyramid at Abu Rawash. His other son, Khafre, built the second pyramid at Giza, slightly smaller than his father's, but appearing taller because it sits on higher ground, and added the Great Sphinx that enigmatic lion with a pharaoh's face, gazing eternally eastward toward the rising sun. Menkaure, Khafre's successor, built the third Giza pyramid, noticeably smaller, a sign perhaps that the kingdom's resources were finally exhausted, or that the race to build ever larger had reached its natural conclusion. And then something extraordinary happened. The obsession ended almost as quickly as it had begun. The 5th and 6th dynasty pharaohs still built pyramids, but smaller ones, constructed more quickly, with less durable materials. They shifted resources instead to sun temples, honoring Ra, whose cult was rising in prominence. The Pyramid Age, that century of megalithic ambition, concluded not with a catastrophe, but with a quiet shift in priorities. Yet what they left behind, the Giza Plateau still dominates the Cairo skyline, these monuments sharing space now with a modern megacity. The pyramids have survived earthquake and erosion, stone robbers who stripped away most of the fine casing stones, tourists who climbed and carved their names, treasure hunters who broke into the chambers searching for gold. They have survived because they are, fundamentally, mountains. Artificial mountains, shaped by human hands according to human vision, but with the permanence of geological features. The ancient Egyptians understood something profound about immortality, that true eternity requires not just ambition but mass. Enough stone, properly arranged, can outlast almost anything. Stand with me at sunset at Giza. The stone glows golden in the failing light. The city noises fade momentarily as the sun approaches the western horizon, following the path it has traced every day for billions of years. In this moment, you can almost feel what the ancient Egyptians felt, that sense of connection to something vast and eternal, that certainty that some things, if built with sufficient will and skill, can transcend the fleeting nature of individual human lives. The pharaohs who built these monuments have been dust for 4,500 years. Their names, preserved in stone, are all that remain of flesh and blood that once walked the earth, that once commanded armies, that once declared themselves divine. Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure. We know these names only because they carved them in stone, massive enough to survive the grinding weight of time. Their bet on immortality paid off in ways they could not have imagined. Not in the literal sense, no pharaoh actually became a star. No resurrection occurred within those carefully sealed chambers. But in another, truer sense, they achieved exactly what they sought. They are remembered. They are spoken of still. They conquered time itself through the simple expedient of moving enough stone into place that nothing short of the end of the world could erase what they built. The Pyramid Age was brief, intense, and transformative. It pushed a civilization to its limits, drained its resources, tested its organizational capabilities. It created wonders that still inspire and perplex. It proved that humans, when united behind a singular vision and convinced of its cosmic importance, can accomplish feats that seem impossible. But it also taught a harder lesson. Even the mightiest civilizations have limits. Even divine kings must eventually account for reality. The Old Kingdom would continue for generations after the last Great Pyramid rose, but it was increasingly unstable, increasingly fragmented. The resources devoted to monuments had starved other essential functions. The power of provincial governors had grown too strong during the building campaigns. The center could not hold forever. The age of pyramids was ending. An age of chaos was approaching. But between the glory and the collapse, Egypt would experience something remarkable: the maturation of a culture, the flowering of art and literature and wisdom literature, the creation of a civilization so rich and complete that its influence would echo through every culture that followed. That story of how Egypt refined itself into something more than pyramids, more than pharaohs, something approaching the eternal civilization it aspired to be, that story continues. The stone mountains remain, patient and permanent, keeping their secrets. There is a pattern written into the fabric of civilizations: rise and fall, order and chaos. The rhythm repeats across human history with almost geological regularity. Egypt, for all its claims to eternal stability, could not escape this fundamental truth. The Old Kingdom did not collapse suddenly. There was no single catastrophic moment, no dramatic invasion that toppled the pharaohs from their throne. Instead, the decline was gradual, insidious, like water slowly undermining the foundation of a great building, until one day, inevitably, it falls. By the later 6th dynasty, around 4,200 years ago, the signs were unmistakable. The pyramids of these later pharaohs were smaller, shoddier, built with rubble cores and thin casings that have since collapsed into shapeless mounds. The royal power was fragmenting. Provincial governors, the nomarchs who had once served at the pharaoh's pleasure, were becoming hereditary lords, passing their positions to their sons, building their own elaborate tombs, acting increasingly like independent kings within their territories. Pepi II came to the throne as a child and ruled, tradition claims, for 94 years, likely an exaggeration, but he certainly reigned for many decades. Imagine the problem this created. A single pharaoh outliving his officials, his sons, even his grandsons. The continuity of government depends on renewal, on fresh talent rising through the ranks. Pepi II's endless reign created stagnation, a gerontocracy that could not adapt to changing circumstances. And circumstances were changing. Climate patterns shifted. The Nile's annual flood, that reliable gift upon which all Egyptian prosperity depended, became less predictable. Some years, the inundation was insufficient, leaving fields dry and harvests meagre. Famine stalked the land. In tomb inscriptions from provincial governors, we read proud boasts. I kept my district alive during the years of famine. I gave grain to the hungry. These boasts reveal the crisis. The governor, not the pharaoh, kept people alive. Local authority was superseding central power. When Pepi II finally died, the Old Kingdom died with him. What followed is known as the First Intermediate Period, and the name barely captures the chaos. Egypt fractured. The north and south split into rival power centers. Multiple dynasties claimed legitimacy simultaneously. The 7th and 8th dynasties at Memphis, the 9th and 10th dynasties at Heracleopolis, and eventually the 11th dynasty rising at Thebes. Kings who ruled for months. Dynasties that controlled perhaps a few nomes, a single city, a stretch of river barely 50 miles long. The civilization that had endured for 8 centuries, that had built monuments to outlast time, descended into civil war. The surviving texts from this period are haunting. Listen to the voice of Ipuwer, a sage whose lament has echoed across 4 millennia. Indeed, the land spins around as does a potter's wheel. Indeed, poor men have become owners of wealth, and he who could not make sandals for himself now possesses riches. Indeed, the noble ladies are now gleaners, and nobles are in the workhouse. The social order had inverted. The certainties that had structured Egyptian life, Ma'at, cosmic order, the divine pharaoh maintaining harmony, all seem to have failed catastrophically. Another text, the Admonitions of an Egyptian Sage, paints an even darker picture. Behold, nobles' ladies starve, while butchers are sated with what they prepared. Behold, no craftsmen work, for the enemies of the land have spoiled its crafts. The river is blood. When one drinks from it, one rejects it as human and thirsts for water. Hyperbole, perhaps, the literary expression of trauma. But rooted in genuine catastrophe, Egypt, which had known unity and prosperity for centuries, was tearing itself apart. And yet something remarkable persisted. Even in chaos, even with multiple kings claiming the throne, Even with civil war devastating the land, Egyptian culture endured. Local governors maintained order in their territories. Artisans continued their crafts. Scribes copied the ancient texts. The temples still operated. The religion adapted, democratized. Even funerary texts that had once been reserved for pharaohs now appeared in the tombs of officials, suggesting that immortality was no longer exclusively royal. This is crucial to understand. Egypt was wounded, but not dead. The fundamental culture, the shared language and religion and way of life, survived the political chaos, which meant that reunification, when it came, would not mean creating something new but restoring something that Egyptians remembered and longed for. The agents of restoration came from Thebes, that city in the south that would, across Egyptian history, repeatedly serve as the heartland of renewal. The nomarchs of Thebes, serving the pharaohs of the 11th dynasty, began pushing north. It was warfare, yes, but warfare in service of reunification, presented as a holy mission to restore Maat. The conflict between Thebes and Heracleopolis lasted for decades. Pitched battles along the Nile, sieges of fortified cities, the gradual accumulation of power as one side gained momentum and the other faltered. We have few detailed records, but we can imagine the struggle armies of Egyptians fighting other Egyptians, each believing they served the legitimate pharaoh, each convinced they fought for Egypt's soul. The decisive figure was Mentuhotep II, whose name means Montu is satisfied, Montu being the falcon-headed war god of Thebes. Here was a warrior pharaoh in the old tradition, combining military prowess with political vision. He fought his way north, defeating the Heracleopolitan dynasty, reuniting Upper and Lower Egypt under a single crown for the first time in more than a century. In his mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, cut into the cliff face across from Thebes, Mentuhotep II depicted his triumph. Soldiers from his army, now buried in collective tombs nearby, bore wounds from battle arrows still embedded in their bones, evidence of violent death in service to reunification. This was no peaceful restoration. This was conquest, righteously presented as the return of order. But Mentuhotep understood that military victory was insufficient. He needed to rebuild not just the kingdom, but the ideology that sustained it. He took both the red crown and the white crown. He reinstituted the old titles and ceremonies. He launched building projects, demonstrating that pharaonic power had returned. He extended control into Nubia, re-establishing Egypt's southern buffer zone against potential threats. Most importantly, he established a new dynasty that would endure. The Middle Kingdom was born. His successors, particularly the pharaohs named Amenemhat and Senusret, perfected what Mentuhotep had begun. They moved the capital to a new city, Itchatawi, strategically located to control both Upper and Lower Egypt. They reorganized the administration, curtailing the power of provincial governors, centralizing authority back in royal hands. They fortified Egypt's borders, a line of fortresses in Nubia, chains of defense in the delta, outposts in the Sinai to control the eastern approaches. Senusret III was perhaps the greatest of these Middle Kingdom pharaohs. His statues show a man with a careworn, almost brooding expression, so different from the serene confidence of Old Kingdom royal portraits. These are the features of a ruler who has known struggle, who understands that power must be constantly maintained, never assumed. He campaigned repeatedly in Nubia, pushing Egyptian control far up the Nile past the Second Cataract. At Semna and Kuma, he built massive fortresses, imposing structures of mud brick that controlled the river passage. Inscriptions proclaimed his conquests. "I have made my boundary farther south than my fathers. I have increased what was bequeathed to me. I am a king who speaks and acts. What my heart conceives is done by my arm." But Senusret also ruled with administrative brilliance. He broke the power of the great provincial families, eliminating the hereditary nomarchs, replacing them with appointed officials who served at royal pleasure. He, reorganized the country into administrative departments, the head of the south and the head of the north, each reporting directly to the vizier, who reported to the pharaoh. The pyramid of power, momentarily flattened during the first intermediate period, was rebuilt with the pharaoh firmly at its apex. The Middle Kingdom saw a flourishing of literature that revealed a more complex, more humanized Egypt than the monumental certainties of the Old Kingdom. The tale of Sinuhe, a masterwork of Egyptian literature, tells of a court official who flees Egypt in panic after the death of Amenemhat I, lives for years in exile in Syria-Palestine, and finally returns home, forgiven and restored to favor. It is a story about identity, about belonging, about what it means to be Egyptian. Sinuhe, even successful and honored in foreign lands, yearns for Egypt with an ache that transcends reason. The Satire of the Trades, another popular text, lists various professions in humorous detail: the farmer beaten by taxes, the washerman handling filthy clothes, the potter covered in mud, all to conclude that the scribe's profession is superior. Yet beneath the humor lies a truth about Middle Kingdom society. It was literate, bureaucratic, increasingly complex. The instructions of Amenemhat, supposedly the dying words of that pharaoh to his son, reveals paranoia born of hard experience. Trust no brother, know no friend, make no intimates. Even when you sleep, guard your heart yourself, for on the day of trouble no man has supporters. The text may actually have been written after Amenemhat. I was assassinated, a stark reminder that even divine kingship could not protect against palace intrigue. The Middle Kingdom was resilient but never regained the effortless supremacy of the Old Kingdom. The pyramids built during this period were smaller, constructed around frameworks of mud brick rather than solid stone. They have eroded badly, many reduced to shapeless mounds. Yet the mortuary complexes surrounding them were elaborate, and the burial chambers were protected by intricate security measures, false passages, hidden doors, portcullises of granite suggesting the pharaohs knew their monuments would be violated and tried desperately to protect the eternal rest they sought. Religious developments reflected the age's anxieties and aspirations. Osiris, the god who died and was resurrected, rose to supreme importance. His myth murdered by his brother Set, dismembered and scattered, reassembled by his sister wife Isis, and resurrected to rule the underworld, resonated with a people who had experienced national death and rebirth. Every Egyptian now hoped to become Osiris in death, to be justified before the divine tribunal, to live forever in the field of reeds where harvests were always abundant and labor was light. The Middle Kingdom lasted approximately 400 years, from around 2050 BC to 1650 BC. For those centuries, Egypt was stable, prosperous, culturally vibrant. Trade networks extended to Punt on the Red Sea coast, to Byblos in Lebanon, to Minoan Crete in the Aegean. Egyptian influence radiated outward. The fortresses in Nubia controlled access to gold, ivory, ebony, and other exotic goods. The eastern delta received immigrants from Syria-Palestine who settled, assimilated, and contributed to Egyptian prosperity. But history's rhythm continued. The 13th dynasty saw a weakening of central authority. Kings succeeded each other rapidly, sometimes ruling for only months. Fortresses in Nubia were abandoned as resources grew scarce. Provincial governors again became semi-independent. The pattern was repeating, as if Egypt could not escape this cycle of unity and fragmentation. And then came something new, something Egypt had never experienced in its long history: foreign conquest. The second intermediate period began not with internal collapse, but with external invasion. Warriors from Syria-Palestine, equipped with new military technologies, bronze weapons, composite bows, and most devastatingly, horse-drawn chariots, swept into the delta, conquering the north, establishing their own dynasties. The Egyptians called them Hyksos, rulers of foreign lands, and their arrival would traumatize Egypt, challenge its sense of invulnerability, and ultimately transform the kingdom into something it had never been before, a militaristic imperial power. The Age of Innocence, if Egypt had ever possessed such a thing, was ending. The kingdom had survived civil war and reunification. It had learned resilience, had proven that Egyptian civilization could endure political chaos. But could it survive foreign domination? Could the culture that believed itself chosen by the gods, protected by geography, eternal by nature, survive the humiliation of conquest by outsiders who worshipped different gods, spoke a different language, ruled according to different principles? That question, and its answer, would define the next chapter of Egypt's long story. The Hyksos were coming, and Egypt would never be quite the same again. There are some wounds that never fully heal, some traumas that reshape a people's soul so profoundly that everything afterward is different. For Egypt, the Hyksos invasion was such a trauma. Picture the Nile Delta around 1650 BC. For 2,000 years, Egypt had been Egyptian unified or divided, strong or weak, but always distinctly itself, ruled by pharaohs who claimed descent from the gods, protected by deserts that formed natural barriers against the outside world. The Egyptians believed themselves special, chosen, eternal. Their civilization was the civilization, the standard by which all others were measured and found wanting, and then foreigners conquered them. The Hyksos came from Syria-Palestine, part of a larger pattern of population movement sweeping across the ancient Near East. They were not a single people, but a coalition, Semitic-speaking groups, perhaps Canaanites and Amorites, seasoned warriors, familiar with the latest military technologies that Egypt in its comfortable isolation had never adopted. They brought horses. This alone was revolutionary. Egypt had known horses only as exotic curiosities, if at all. The Hyksos brought them as weapons of war, yoked to light, fast chariots that could sweep across a battlefield with devastating speed. Imagine seeing this for the first time, the thunder of hooves, the cloud of dust, warriors standing in these mobile platforms shooting arrows, retreating before infantry could engage, striking again from a different angle. Traditional Egyptian tactics, developed over centuries of fighting Nubian tribesmen and Libyan raiders, were suddenly obsolete. They brought composite bows, laminated weapons of wood, horn, and sinew that could send arrows farther and with more power than the simple wooden bows Egyptians used. They brought improved bronze weapons, swords, and armor of a quality Egypt had not achieved. They brought siege techniques for reducing fortified cities. And they brought something perhaps more important than any weapon, the will to conquest. These were people hardened by the competitive violence of the Near East, where city-states constantly warred, where survival meant innovation and aggression. Egypt, for all its military tradition, had grown complacent within its protective geography. The invasion was not sudden. The Hyksos had been settling in the eastern delta for generations, immigrants seeking opportunity in Egypt's wealthy northern territories. At first they assimilated, adopted Egyptian customs, served Egyptian lords. But as the 13th dynasty weakened, as central authority fragmented once again, these foreign communities grew stronger, more independent, more ambitious. Around 1650 BC, a Hyksos ruler named Salitis, or so the later historian Manetho tells us, seized Memphis, the ancient capital at the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt. The psychological impact was immense. Memphis, founded by Narmer himself, held sacred since the unification fell to foreign conquerors. The Hyksos established their capital at Avaris in the eastern delta, a strategic location that controlled trade routes to Syria-Palestine while also commanding access to the Nile. They adopted Egyptian royal titles and iconography, styled themselves as pharaohs, wrapped their rule in the trappings of traditional legitimacy. But to the native Egyptians, particularly those in the unconquered south, these were usurpers, foreign kings ruling by force rather than divine right. The kingdom split. The Hyksos 15th dynasty controlled the Delta and Middle Egypt, the wealthiest and most populous regions. A subordinate 16th dynasty of lesser Hyksos rulers controlled portions of the south. And in Thebes, far to the south, Egyptian princes maintained independence, ruling the 17th dynasty in a kingdom diminished but defiant. For perhaps a century this partition persisted. The Hyksos traded with Nubia, established diplomatic relations with Syria-Palestine, and managed Egypt's economy with reasonable competence. They were not, as later Egyptian propaganda would claim, barbaric destroyers. They respected Egyptian culture even as they ruled it. They worshipped Set, the Egyptian god of chaos and foreigners, equating him with their own storm deities. They built monuments. They maintained the temples, though perhaps less lavishly than native pharaohs. But they were foreigners, and to the Thebans in the south, this was an abomination that demanded correction. The War of Liberation began not with armies but with insults. The Hyksos king Apophis, ruling from Avaris, sent a message to Seqenenre-Tao, the Egyptian king at Thebes. The complaint was absurd. Apophis claimed that the bellowing of hippopotamuses in the sacred pool at Thebes, 500 miles to the south, was disturbing. His sleep. It was theatre, a calculated provocation designed to assert dominance, to force the Theban king to acknowledge Hyksos supremacy. Seqenenre-Tao refused to submit. War erupted, and Seqenenre paid for his defiance with his life. His mummy, discovered in the 19th century, reveals a horrific death skull fractured by multiple blows from axes and daggers, wounds that match Hyksos weapons. He died in battle, or perhaps was captured and executed. A king who chose war over submission. His son Kamosi inherited both the throne and the war. We have Kamosi's own words, preserved on stelae at Karnak Temple. Why do I contemplate my strength when a prince is in Avaris and another in Kush, and I sit here united with an Asiatic and a Nubian? Each man has his portion of Egypt, dividing the land with me. It was intolerable, Egypt divided among foreigners. Kamosi launched campaigns north, attacking Hyksos positions, disrupting their trade with Nubia, besieging their fortresses. He captured ships, plundered towns, sent bronze axes and daggers to be melted down and reforged. His was a war of resistance, guerrilla strikes that harassed the Hyksos but could not yet defeat them. The stelae record both victories and frustrations. Kamosi's own officials questioned him. Why fight them? We are content. To which Kamosi responded with passion, I will grapple with him. I will rip open his belly. My wish is to save Egypt and smite the Asiatics. Here was nationalism, raw and fierce, not merely a political dispute between rival dynasties, but an existential struggle for Egyptian identity itself. Kamosi died after perhaps 5 years of warfare, his liberation incomplete. But he had wounded the Hyksos, shown they were vulnerable, kept the flame of resistance alive. His brother, Ahmose, still a child when Kamosi died, would complete what his father and brother had begun. Ahmose came of age in a kingdom at war. His entire youth was shaped by struggle against the Hyksos, where earlier pharaohs had claimed divinity almost casually. Ahmose had to prove his legitimacy through victory. He reorganized the Egyptian army, adopting the very weapons that had given the Hyksos their advantage: chariots, composite bows, improved bronze equipment. If innovation had conquered Egypt, innovation would liberate it. The campaigns were systematic, methodical, gradually tightening the noose around Hyksos territories. Ahmose pushed north, reducing fortified towns one by one. The autobiography of Ahmose, son of Abana, a sailor who served in the liberation wars, provides rare detail. I followed the sovereign on foot when he rode about on his chariot. When the town of Avaris was besieged, I fought bravely on foot in his majesty's presence. Thereupon I was appointed to the ship rising in Memphis. Then there was fighting on the water in the canal of Avaris. Thereupon I made a capture, and I carried away a hand. That last detail, carrying away a severed hand, was how Egyptian soldiers proved their kills, collecting grim trophies to claim rewards. This was warfare at its most brutal and personal. The siege of Avaris was protracted and desperate. The Hyksos capital was strongly fortified, supplied by sea from Syria-Palestine, defended by warriors who knew defeat meant death or enslavement. But Ahmose persisted. The Egyptians learned siege warfare, built ramps to overtop walls, tunneled beneath defences, starved the defenders. Finally, Avaris fell. The Hyksos capital, seat of foreign rule for more than a century, was captured. The 15th dynasty was finished, but Ahmose did not stop. He pursued the fleeing Hyksos into Palestine itself, besieging the fortress city of Sharuhen for 3 years until it too surrendered. This was unprecedented. Egyptian armies had raided beyond the borders before, but sustained campaigns in foreign territory represented a new strategic vision. Never again would Egypt wait passively for threats to materialize. Security now meant forward defense, buffer zones, client states that would absorb invasions before they reached Egyptian soil. The psychological transformation was complete. Egypt had entered the second intermediate period as a confident civilization that believed geography and divine favor made it invulnerable. It emerged from the Hyksos period as a militarized state, traumatized by conquest, determined to prevent any repetition through aggressive expansion and constant military readiness. Ahmose turned south as well, crushing resistance in Nubia, re-establishing Egyptian control of the trade routes and gold mines. He rewarded his soldiers with gold and land. He restored temples damaged during the wars. He repositioned Egypt not just as it had been, but as something new, an imperial power, aggressive and expansionist, determined to dominate rather than merely endure. The new kingdom was born not in triumph but in trauma, born in the humiliation of foreign rule and the fierce pride of liberation, born in the realization that isolation was not protection, that Egypt must either dominate its neighbors or risk being dominated by them. Consider what the Hyksos invasion achieved paradoxically. It shattered Egyptian complacency and forced innovation. It introduced military technologies that would make Egypt a regional superpower. It created a warrior culture that would produce some of history's most successful conqueror kings. The Hyksos, in conquering Egypt, inadvertently armed and motivated the force that would create an Egyptian empire. Ahmose, I became the founder of the 18th dynasty, the beginning of Egypt's imperial age. Later generations would worship him as a hero god, the liberator who restored Egyptian honor. His victories were commemorated in temples and tomb paintings, mythologized until history and legend became inseparable. But the memory of occupation never faded. Centuries later, Egyptian texts still referred to the Hyksos period with visceral hatred. The trauma had scarred the national psyche. Where Old Kingdom Egyptians had built pyramids with serene confidence in their eternal superiority, New Kingdom Egyptians built an empire with the desperation of people who knew what it meant to be conquered. The lesson was learned and never forgotten. Strength was not optional. Expansion was not arrogance but necessity. Vigilance was not paranoia but wisdom. The world beyond Egypt's borders was dangerous, filled with peoples who coveted Egyptian wealth, who would invade if given opportunity. This worldview would drive the next 5 centuries of Egyptian history. It would send armies into Syria and Palestine, into Nubia and Libya. It would create an empire stretching from the Euphrates to the Fourth Cataract. It would produce warrior pharaohs whose names still resonate: Thutmose III, the Napoleon of Egypt; Hatshepsut, the woman who became pharaoh, Akhenaten, the heretic who defied the gods, Ramesses II, the self-proclaimed greatest pharaoh of all. The Age of Innocence, if it had ever existed, was definitively over. Egypt had tasted both defeat and victory, humiliation and triumph. It had learned that survival required power, that power required constant vigilance, that vigilance required an empire to provide warning of threats and resources to meet them. The Hyksos had wanted to rule Egypt. Instead, they created the conditions for Egypt to rule the ancient Near East. Stand with me once more beside the Nile, but now in the early New Kingdom. The river flows as it always has, eternal and life-giving. But the people have changed. Where once stood farmers content with their strips of land, now stand soldiers drilling with bronze weapons. Where once rose temples to peaceful gods, now rise monuments celebrating military victories. Where once pharaohs contemplated eternity through massive tombs, now pharaohs contemplate dominion over foreign lands. The liberation was complete. The empire was about to begin. And Egypt, tempered by conquest and fired by the determination never to submit again, was about to experience its greatest age. The sun was rising on the empire of the sun. There are moments when a civilization reaches such heights that it seems touched by something beyond the merely human, when power, wealth, culture, and ambition converge to create an age that defines a people for all time. The New Kingdom of Egypt, spanning 5 centuries from 1500 to 1000 BC, was such a moment. This was Egypt's imperial zenith, the age when pharaohs commanded armies that marched from Nubia to Syria, when gold flowed from conquered territories in quantities that stagger imagination, when temples rose so massive that they dwarf anything built before or since, when Egyptian culture radiated outward, influencing every civilization it touched. The architects of this empire were warriors, and the first among them was Thutmose I. Ahmose had liberated Egypt and begun the work of expansion. His successors consolidated, strengthened, prepared. But Thutmose I, ascending the throne around 1500 BC, had grander visions. He campaigned deep into Nubia, pushing Egyptian control past the Third Cataract, erecting boundary stelae that proclaimed Egyptian dominion. He marched into Syria, crossing the Euphrates River, an achievement so extraordinary that his grandson would later boast of matching it and set up a victory stela on the river's far bank, announcing that Egypt's reach now extended to the limits of the known world. But even Thutmose was merely the prelude. The true architect of empire, the pharaoh who would be called the Napoleon of Egypt, was his grandson, Thutmose III. Yet, before we meet him, we must pause to consider one of ancient history's most remarkable figures, a woman who became pharaoh, who ruled Egypt for more than 20 years with skill and success, who built monuments that rival anything her male counterparts achieved. Hatshepsut. She was royal by birth, daughter of Thutmose I, wife of Thutmose II. When her husband died, the heir was Thutmose III, her stepson, still a child. Hatshepsut became regent, as was traditional, but then she did something unprecedented. She declared herself pharaoh, not queen, not regent acting in a child's name. Pharaoh, the divine ruler, the living Horus, the son of Ra. Official art depicts her with the ceremonial beard of kingship, the Nemes headdress, all the traditional regalia. Inscriptions use masculine grammatical forms when referring to the pharaoh, though feminine forms for Hatshepsut the person. It was a careful fiction, maintaining the ideology of divine kingship while accommodating the reality of a woman in power. And she ruled brilliantly. Her greatest achievement was not military conquest, but commerce and construction. She launched a famous expedition to Punt, the mysterious land far to the south on the Red Sea coast, modern Somalia or southern Arabia. perhaps returning with incense trees, myrrh, gold, ivory, ebony, exotic animals. The temple walls at Deir el-Bahari depict the journey in exquisite detail. Egyptian ships under sail, the houses of Punt built on stilts, the corpulent Queen of Punt greeting the Egyptian envoys, goods being loaded for the return journey. This was not conquest but trade, not domination but partnership. Yet it brought Egypt wealth and prestige, demonstrated that female pharaoh could provide prosperity just as any man. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari is a masterpiece, 3 terraced colonnades built against the cliff face, rising in perfect symmetry, designed by the architect Senenmut, who was perhaps also her lover, though evidence is ambiguous. Even today, damaged by time and deliberate vandalism, it remains one of Egypt's most beautiful monuments. Hatshepsut ruled for approximately 22 years. Then she died, or was deposed. The record is unclear, and Thutmose III, now a mature man, finally claimed sole power, and he did so with a fury that would reshape the ancient world. Was he resentful at being kept from power during his youth? Did he resent Hatshepsut's usurpation? Later in his reign, Hatshepsut's images were defaced, her names chiseled from monuments, her memory attacked with systematic thoroughness. Whether Thutmose ordered this, or it happened after his death, remains debated. But one thing is certain. When Thutmose III became sole ruler, he unleashed military campaigns of unprecedented scope and success. 17 military campaigns over 20 years, 17 times the pharaoh led his armies north into Syria-Palestine, conquering, subjugating, collecting tribute. The climactic battle came at Megiddo, that strategic fortress commanding the pass through the Carmel Ridge. A coalition of Canaanite and Syrian princes had rebelled against Egyptian overlordship, gathering at Megiddo with perhaps 10,000 warriors. Thutmose's generals advised caution, a safe route of approach, but the pharaoh, young and eager for glory, chose the dangerous narrow pass, leading his army single file through terrain where they were vulnerable to ambush. It was calculated risk, bold to the point of recklessness, but it worked. The Egyptians emerged from the pass before the enemy expected, caught them off guard, routed them completely. The defeated kings fled into Megiddo and barred the gates, abandoning their camps, their horses, their gold-plated chariots. The siege that followed lasted 7 months. When Megiddo finally fell, the captured plunder was staggering. 924 chariots, 200 suits of armor, 2,041 horses, 25,000 cattle, tens of thousands of sheep and goats, gold, silver, furniture, weapons. The princes who had rebelled came forth bearing tribute, pledging loyalty, sending their sons as hostages to the Egyptian court. It was a watershed moment. Syrian Palestine, that fractious region of city-states and tribal territories, came under Egyptian hegemony. Not direct administration, Egypt lacked the resources and mechanisms for that, but a system of client kings who paid tribute, provided troops when required, maintained order on Egypt's behalf. Rebel and face annihilation, submit and prosper under Egyptian protection. Thutmose pushed further. He campaigned in Syria, bringing the powerful kingdom of Mitanni to heel. He crossed the Euphrates, as his grandfather had, erecting his own victory stela. He received tribute from Assyria, from Babylon, from the Hittites far to the north in Anatolia. These great kingdoms, peers in power, acknowledged Egypt's supremacy with gifts of gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and precious woods. The wealth flowing into Egypt was unprecedented. The temples of Amun at Karnak and Luxor became depositories for international tribute. The priesthood of Amun grew wealthy and powerful, for the pharaoh attributed his victories to this chief of the gods. Gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, silver from Anatolia, copper from Cyprus, Egypt, became the center of an economic system spanning the entire eastern Mediterranean and Near East. And Thutmose built. The Hall of Annals at Karnak records his campaigns year by year, city by city, listing tribute and plunder with bureaucratic precision. Obelisks rose at Karnak, needles of granite pointing skyward, tips covered in electrum that caught the sun. One, toppled and broken, was the tallest ever erected 97 feet of solid granite, quarried at Aswan, transported hundreds of miles down the Nile, raised upright through engineering that still impresses. When Thutmose III died after 54 years associated with the throne, first as junior co-regent, then as sole ruler, Egypt stood at the pinnacle of ancient Near Eastern power. The empire stretched from the Fourth Cataract in Nubia to the Euphrates in Syria. No kingdom could challenge Egypt militarily. No ruler could match the pharaoh's wealth. The pharaohs who followed maintained this empire with varying degrees of success. Amenhotep II campaigned to suppress rebellions, executed captive princes with his own hands, hung their bodies from the walls of Thebes as warnings. Thutmose IV negotiated a treaty with Mitanni, ending decades of rivalry, marrying a Mitannian princess in a diplomatic alliance. Amenhotep III, inheriting a stable empire, devoted himself to building on a scale that beggars description. The Temple of Amun at Luxor, the Colossi of Memnon, two massive seated statues of the pharaoh, each 70 feet high, which still guard the entrance to his ruined mortuary temple. The Malkata Palace complex, a sprawling city of mud brick where the court resided in luxury. Hundreds of statues of the goddess Sekhmet, lioness-headed deity of war and healing. Amenhotep III built more monuments than perhaps any pharaoh before him, and he did so in peacetime, ruling for nearly 40 years of prosperity and peace. But beneath this golden surface, tensions were building. The priesthood of Amun had grown immensely powerful, controlling vast estates, commanding enormous wealth. The international diplomacy revealed in the Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and other kingdoms, shows a complex world of rival powers, shifting alliances, constant negotiations, and within the royal family, radical ideas were stirring. Amenhotep IV ascended the throne, and within a few years did something unprecedented in Egyptian history. He changed his name to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, and declared that there was only one true god, the Aten, the visible solar disk. Not a moon, not Ra, not the multitude of gods Egyptians had worshipped for 3,000 years, only the Aten. It was religious revolution, heresy, madness, his enemies would later claim. Akhenaten closed the temples of the traditional gods, appropriated their wealth, diverted resources to building a new capital city at Amarna, midway between Memphis and Thebes. Akhetaten Horizon of the Aten rose from desert sand, a city dedicated entirely to the worship of one god, built in less than 5 years through frantic effort. The art from this period is startling, unlike anything before or after in Egyptian history. Akhenaten, depicted with an elongated skull, feminine hips, a protruding belly, deliberate distortion that broke 3,000 years of artistic convention. His wife, Nefertiti, shown with exquisite beauty, but also in intimate family scenes, unprecedented in royal iconography. Playing with their daughters, kissing under the sun's rays, human rather than divine. The great hymn to the Aten, perhaps composed by Akhenaten himself, expresses a vision of universal deity, unlike traditional Egyptian polytheism. You are in my heart, there is none other who knows you but your son, Akhenaten. You have made him wise in your plans and your power. The world came into being by your hand, according as you have made them. When you have risen, they live. When you set, they die. You are lifetime your own self, for one lives only through you. But the revolution failed. The empire, neglected while Akhenaten focused on religious transformation, began fragmenting. The Amarna letters show desperate pleas from client kings in Syria-Palestine. "Send troops. The Hittites are attacking. We are beset by enemies." And Akhenaten, absorbed in his solar theology, did nothing. When he died, the reaction was swift and severe. His son, known to history as Tutankhamun, was initially named Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, but within a few years changed his name to honor Amun. The old gods were restored. The temples reopened. Akhetaten was abandoned, allowed to crumble back into the desert from which it had risen. Later, pharaohs would call Akhenaten the criminal and systematically erase his name from monuments. Tutankhamun himself died young, perhaps 18 years old, after only 9 years of rule. His tomb, discovered almost intact by Howard Carter in 1922, reveals the astonishing wealth of the new kingdom. The gold mask, the elaborate jewelry, the chariots and furniture and weapons, the preserved food and wine for the afterlife. All this for a minor pharaoh who accomplished little of note. Imagine then what the tombs of great pharaohs like Thutmose III or Ramesses II must have contained before thieves plundered them in antiquity. The 18th dynasty ended in uncertainty, generals seizing power, short reigns, and disputed successions. But the 19th dynasty, beginning with Ramesses I and his son Seti I, restored stability and reignited imperial ambitions. And then came Ramesses II. If Thutmose III was Egypt's greatest conqueror, Ramesses II was its greatest builder, and perhaps its most effective propagandist. He ruled for 67 years, one of the longest reigns in history, and he used every one of those years to establish himself as the greatest pharaoh who ever lived. He built temples throughout Egypt and Nubia. At Abu Simbel in Nubia, 4 colossal seated statues of himself, each 70 feet high, carved from the cliff face, guarding a temple that penetrates deep into the rock. Twice a year, on the pharaoh's birthday and coronation day, the sun's rays would penetrate the entire length of the temple to illuminate the sanctuary, a feat of astronomical calculation and architectural precision. At Thebes, the Ramesseum, his massive mortuary temple. At Karnak, the enormous hypostyle hall, 134 columns, the central ones 70 feet high, decorated with elaborate carvings and original bright paint. At Pi-Ramesses in the Delta, his new capital, though little remains today, but Ramesses is remembered most for Kadesh, the battle that nearly killed him, that he turned through propaganda into his greatest victory, that became the subject of countless temple reliefs and triumphal inscriptions. In his 5th year, Ramesses marched north to confront the Hittite Empire. Then, at its peak under King Muwatalli, the two superpowers met at Kadesh on the Orontes River in Syria. What happened there is subject to debate. The Egyptian and Hittite accounts differ dramatically. The Egyptian version, told and retold on temple walls throughout Egypt. Ramesses, leading one of 4 Egyptian divisions, was ambushed by Hittite chariots. His forces scattered. He found himself surrounded, abandoned, facing death. In desperation, he called upon Amun, and the god answered. Ramesses fought like a god himself, rallying his troops, driving back the enemy, winning glorious victory. The Hittite version, preserved in their archives, the battle was inconclusive. Both sides suffered heavy losses. Eventually they negotiated a peace treaty, Egypt and Hatti, agreeing to non-aggression and mutual defense. The truth, probably closer to the Hittite account. Ramesses survived a near disaster through personal courage, but achieved no decisive victory. Yet his propaganda was so effective that for 3,000 years, Kadesh was remembered as Ramesses' triumph. And the peace treaty that followed the first international peace treaty in recorded history was actually a diplomatic achievement worth celebrating. Egypt and Hatti, The two superpowers agreed to end their rivalry. Ramesses married a Hittite princess. Trade and diplomatic correspondence flourished. For the rest of Ramesses' long reign, the northern border was secure. He fathered over 100 children by numerous wives and concubines. Many of his sons predeceased him. He outlived the first dozen heirs. When he finally died at perhaps 90 years old, his 13th son, Merenptah, already an old man himself, inherited the throne. Ramesses II dominated his age so completely that later pharaohs named themselves after him. 9 more Ramesses would rule Egypt, though none matched the second's accomplishments or longevity. His mummy, discovered in a cache of royal mummies, shows a tall man with strong features, hair dyed red with henna in old age, preserved so well that the face still bears an expression that seems imperious, regal, confident. The new kingdom, that age of empire, was the culmination of everything Egypt had built across 3,000 years. The administrative systems developed in the Old Kingdom, the military innovations forced by the Hyksos invasion, the wealth accumulated through trade and conquest, the religious ideology that made the pharaoh a living god. All these elements converged to create 5 centuries of unprecedented power. But empires, like pyramids, require constant maintenance, and Egypt, having reached such heights, could only descend. The Sea Peoples were coming. Bronze Age collapse was approaching. The systems that sustained international trade and diplomatic stability were about to fail catastrophically. Egypt would survive. It always survived, but the empire, that far-flung dominion from Nubia to Syria, would slip away, territory by territory, until only the heartland remained. The age of empire was drawing to a close. The long decline was about to begin. But that story of how even the mightiest fall, how even Egypt could not escape history's grinding wheel, awaits us next. There is something profoundly moving about witnessing greatness fade. Not a sudden catastrophic end, but a gradual dimming, like the sun setting over the Nile, still beautiful, still magnificent, but inevitably descending toward darkness. The final centuries of independent pharaonic Egypt were such a sunset. The end began not with Egyptian weakness, but with a catastrophe that engulfed the entire Bronze Age world. Around 1200 BC, the intricate system of international trade, diplomacy, and stability that had connected the great kingdoms Egypt, Hatti, Assyria, Babylon, Mycenaean Greece collapsed with stunning rapidity. We call them the Sea Peoples, though that name barely captures who they were. A confederation of displaced populations, refugees and raiders, moving across the Mediterranean and Near East in waves of destruction. Their origins remain mysterious, perhaps groups fleeing drought or famine, perhaps warriors seeking new lands after their own kingdoms fell, perhaps a combination of factors that cascaded into migration on an unprecedented scale. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's great rival and late ally, fell completely. Their capital, Hattusa, was burned. Their kingdom, which had stood for centuries, vanished from history so thoroughly that its very existence was forgotten until archaeologists rediscovered it 3,000 years later. Mycenaean Greece collapsed into dark ages. The great trading cities of Syria-Palestine, Ugarit, Byblos, others were destroyed, their Linear B tablets preserving desperate final messages. The enemy's ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Egypt survived, but barely and only at tremendous cost. The first wave struck during the reign of Merenptah, Ramesses II's successor. The Libyans, pushed by drought and hunger, invaded from the west, accompanied by Sea People's contingents. Merenptah met them in battle and won barely. His victory inscription boasts of 13,000 enemy dead, but the tone suggests desperation rather than triumph. This was survival, not conquest. Then came Ramesses III, last of the great warrior pharaohs, facing multiple invasions during his 31-year reign. The Libyans attacked again from the west. The Sea Peoples came by land and sea, a massive coordinated assault that threatened Egypt's very existence. The temple walls at Medinet Habu depict the battles in vivid relief. Egyptian ships engaging enemy vessels in the Nile Delta, infantry battling foreign warriors, captives being led away in chains. Ramesses III won. Egypt survived, but the victory was Pyrrhic. The empire was gone. Syrian Palestine, Nubia, the territories that had provided tribute and resources were lost or became too costly to hold. The international trade networks had collapsed. Egypt was forced back on its own resources, and those resources were diminishing. The economic situation became dire. Workers at Deir el-Medina, the village housing the craftsmen who built the royal tombs, went on strike, perhaps the first recorded labor strike in history. They had not been paid their grain rations. They sat down and refused to work until the government provided what it owed. In earlier, wealthier times, such a situation would have been unthinkable. Ramesses III himself fell victim to a conspiracy. The Harem conspiracy. It is called a plot involving one of his minor wives who sought to place her son on the throne instead of the designated heir. The conspiracy was discovered, the plotters executed, but modern examination of Ramesses III's mummy suggests the assassins may have partially succeeded. His throat was cut, the wound deep enough to be fatal. He died, whether from the assassination or natural causes, shortly after, and with him died the last remnants of imperial greatness. What followed was decline so gradual, so inexorable, that it must have been difficult for Egyptians to perceive. Each generation was poorer than the last, but each still called their ruler pharaoh, still maintained the temples, still believed in Egypt's eternal greatness, even as the evidence mounted that eternity was ending. The late 19th and 20th dynasties saw a succession of weak pharaohs, most named Ramesses, as if invoking the great name could restore the glory it represented. But these were shadows of the second Ramesses. Their pyramids were small mud-brick structures that have long since crumbled. Their tombs were unfinished or reused. Their monuments were often constructed from stones plundered from earlier, grander buildings, a literal cannibalization of past glory to maintain present dignity. Tomb robbery became epidemic. The very monuments built to ensure eternal life became targets for desperate thieves seeking gold and jewels. Papyri preserve court records of robbery trials, revealing that even the tomb guardians themselves were complicit. The tombs of the great pharaohs, Thutmose III, Seti I, Ramesses II, were violated, their mummies stripped of jewelry, their treasures plundered. Eventually, priests secretly moved the royal mummies to hidden caches, reburying them in unmarked locations to protect them from further desecration. By the end of the New Kingdom, around 1070 BC, Egypt was fragmenting once again. The pharaoh controlled the delta from Tanis. The high priest of Amun at Thebes controlled the south, functionally independent, sometimes even dating documents to his own regnal years as if he were pharaoh. Egypt, united for 2,000 years at various times, was dividing yet again. And then came foreign conquerors, wave after wave, each leaving their mark on a civilization too weakened to effectively resist. The Nubians came first. Those peoples Egypt had conquered and dominated for a millennium, who had adopted Egyptian culture and religion, who built pyramids in imitation of their former masters, they now marched north as conquerors. The 25th dynasty, ruling from approximately 747 to 656 BC, consisted of Nubian pharaohs. They were not barbarian invaders. They were, in some ways, more Egyptian than the Egyptians, zealous restorers of traditional culture, devoted worshippers of Amun, builders of monuments in classical styles. Pianki, the first Nubian pharaoh to rule all Egypt, left a magnificent stela describing his conquest as a holy mission to restore proper worship and order. His successor Shabaka claimed to have found ancient religious texts on worm-eaten leather and ordered them copied to preserve them, whether true or propaganda, justifying his rule through appeals to tradition. But Egypt, even under Nubian rulers, could not escape the rising power to the east. Assyria, the brutal military machine of the ancient Near East, had been expanding for centuries. Now, under kings like Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, Assyrian armies marched into Egypt. The Assyrians were conquerors of a different sort. They ruled through terror mass deportations, cities razed, populations enslaved. When they took Memphis, they sacked it. When they marched to Thebes, the great city that had stood for 2,000 years, they plundered it so thoroughly that the Greek poet Homer, writing centuries later, still spoke of 100-gated Thebes as a byword for unimaginable wealth. The Nubian pharaohs fled south. Native Egyptian rulers emerged, paying tribute to Assyria, governing as vassals. The 26th dynasty, known as the Saite period after their capital Sais in the Delta, represented a brief renaissance, a final flowering of traditional Egyptian culture under native rule, though always in the shadow of Assyrian power. Psamtik I, ruling from 664 to 610 BC, reunified Egypt and asserted independence as Assyrian power waned. He and his successors consciously revived Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom art styles, as if by recreating the forms of past greatness they could restore its substance. Beautiful reliefs, exquisite statuary, refined craftsmanship. The Saite period produced art as technically accomplished as anything Egypt had created. But it was a renaissance built on nostalgia, on looking backward rather than forward. Egypt was living in its own past, preserving rather than innovating. The world had moved on. New powers were rising, and Egypt, for all its ancient glory, could not match them. The Persians came next. Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Empire, conquered Babylon in 539 BC. His son Cambyses conquered Egypt in 525 BC, making it a satrapy, a province of the Persian Empire. The 27th dynasty consisted entirely of Persian rulers governing Egypt from distant Persia. The Egyptians never accepted this. They rebelled repeatedly, sometimes successfully for brief periods. The 28th, 29th, and 30th dynasties represented moments of native independence, flickers of the old spirit asserting itself, but the rebellions were always crushed. The Persians returned, reconquered, punished. Nectanebo II, ruling from 360 to 343 BC, was the last native Egyptian pharaoh. He built extensively, devoted himself to traditional religion, maintained the forms and ceremonies as they had been maintained for 3 millennia. Then the Persians returned in force under Artaxerxes III. Nectanebo fled to Nubia. Egypt fell once more to foreign rule. This time, the occupation lasted barely a decade before an even greater power arrived from the west. Alexander the Great, the Macedonian conqueror who swept across the ancient world like a force of nature, marched into Egypt in 332 BC. The Persians fled without significant resistance. The Egyptians, oppressed by Persian rule, welcomed Alexander as a liberator, and Alexander was clever enough to present himself as such. He visited the oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis in the western desert. The priests, whether sincere or politically astute, declared him the son of Amun, divine pharaoh in the traditional sense. Alexander sacrificed to Egyptian gods, respected temples, posed for statuary and pharaonic regalia. He founded Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, a city that would become one of the greatest in the ancient world. But Alexander was gone as quickly as he arrived, marching east to conquer Persia, to push into India, to die at 32 years old in Babylon, his vast empire immediately fragmenting among his generals. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest companions, Ptolemy Soter, Ptolemy the Savior, seized Egypt and established a dynasty that would rule for 3 centuries. The Ptolemaic period, from 305 to 30 BC, represented Egypt's final chapter as an independent kingdom. The Ptolemies were Greek, spoke Greek, thought in Greek terms. They established their capital at Alexandria, that cosmopolitan Mediterranean city rather than ancient Memphis or Thebes. Yet they maintained the fiction of pharaonic legitimacy, built temples in traditional Egyptian style, supported the priesthood, allowed Egyptian culture to continue alongside Greek. It was a hybrid civilization: Greek administrators and generals, Egyptian priests and farmers. Alexandria, with its famous library and lighthouse, became a center of Hellenistic learning, producing mathematicians like Euclid, geographers like Eratosthenes, inventors like Hero. Egyptian temples still operated according to traditions thousands of years old. Priests still performed rituals in hieroglyphic script that Greek scholars could no longer read. The Ptolemies fought among themselves, brother against sister, mother against son, civil wars and assassinations that weakened the kingdom decade by decade. They faced rebellions from native Egyptians, resentful of Greek rule. They gradually lost their empire, Cyrenaica, Cyprus, Palestine, until only Egypt itself remained. And to the west, a new power was rising: Rome, expanding across the Mediterranean, crushing Carthage, conquering Greece, extending its reach toward the wealthy kingdoms of the East. The Ptolemies became clients, dependent on Roman support, paying tribute, watching nervously as the Republic became an empire. Through it all, Egypt endured, diminished, conquered, occupied, yet still recognizably Egypt. The temples still stood, the Nile still flooded, the farmers still planted and harvested. The ancient rhythms continued even as dynasties rose and fell, even as foreign rulers came and went. But the final act was approaching. The last of the Ptolemies was about to take the stage, a woman of legendary intelligence and charisma, who would try desperately to preserve her kingdom's independence against the inexorable rise of Rome. Cleopatra VII, whose story would become legend, whose death would mark the end of 3,000 years of pharaonic Egypt. The sun was setting on the Nile, the long decline was reaching its conclusion. The civilization that had built the pyramids, that had created hieroglyphs, that had worshipped gods whose names were already ancient when Rome was founded, that civilization was about to end, not destroyed, not erased, but transformed, absorbed, becoming a province of another empire, living on in memory and influence but no longer independent, no longer itself. The final chapter was about to unfold, and with it an epoch of human history would close forever. Every story, no matter how long, must reach its ending. For pharaonic Egypt, a civilization that had endured for 3 millennia, that ending came not with barbaric destruction, but with something more complex: transformation, absorption, a gradual fade into legend. When Alexander died in 323 BC, his generals gathered like wolves over a carcass, each seizing what territory they could claim. Ptolemy, perhaps the most pragmatic of them, took Egypt. He understood what he possessed: not just a wealthy kingdom, but a symbol, an ancient land that conferred legitimacy on whoever ruled it. Ptolemy declared himself pharaoh, though he was Macedonian to his core. He established his capital at Alexandria, that new city on the Mediterranean coast where Greek and Egyptian worlds met. And he did something brilliant. He stole Alexander's body. The great conqueror's corpse, being transported back to Macedonia for burial, was intercepted by Ptolemy and brought to Egypt. Alexander was entombed first in Memphis, later in Alexandria itself, in a tomb that became a pilgrimage site for centuries. Possession of Alexander's body conferred a kind of sacred authority, linking Ptolemy's dynasty to the divine conqueror who had liberated Egypt from Persian rule. The early Ptolemies ruled competently. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, built the library and museum at Alexandria, attracting scholars from across the Mediterranean world. The library grew to hold hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the collected knowledge of the ancient world, copied, catalogued, preserved. Scholars worked under royal patronage, producing advances in mathematics, astronomy, geography, medicine. Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. Euclid wrote his Elements, the foundation of geometry. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures, was produced here. The lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, rose on the island of Pharos, a tower 400 feet high, topped with a mirror that reflected sunlight by day and fire by night, guiding ships safely to harbour. It was engineering as spectacular as anything the Old Kingdom pharaohs had achieved, but in a different idiom, serving a maritime commercial empire rather than eternal gods. The Ptolemies maintained the ancient traditions, even as they imported Greek culture. They built temples in traditional Egyptian style: Edfu, Dendera, Philae, Komombo, massive structures covered in hieroglyphic inscriptions, decorated with images of Ptolemaic pharaohs making offerings to Egyptian gods. The priests accepted Greek rulers who paid for temple construction and maintained the cults. The hieroglyphic inscriptions praised these foreign pharaohs in terms identical to those used for Thutmose III or Ramesses II 1,000 years earlier. It was a remarkable cultural synthesis. In Alexandria and the other Greek cities, people spoke Greek, read Homer, attended theatres where Greek plays were performed, worshipped Greek gods. In the Egyptian countryside, people spoke Egyptian, worked the land as their ancestors had, worshipped at temples where rituals unchanged for millennia continued. 2 civilizations occupying the same territory, intersecting at points of commerce and administration, but remaining largely separate. Yet the dynasty was troubled from the start. The Ptolemies married their siblings, an Egyptian royal tradition they adopted, though it scandalized Greek sensibilities. Brother-sister marriages, meant to concentrate power, instead bred instability. Civil wars erupted regularly. Ptolemy IV murdered his mother, uncle, and brother to secure his throne. Ptolemy VI fought his brother Ptolemy VIII in a war that devastated the kingdom. Ptolemy VIII then married his brother's widow, his own sister, and later married her daughter, his niece, while still married to her mother. These were not the dignified god-kings of ancient tradition. These were Hellenistic rulers, ruthless and paranoid, brilliant and brutal, maintaining power through violence and cunning in a Mediterranean world where kingdoms rose and fell with stunning rapidity. The kingdom slowly contracted. Territories were lost to rival powers or declared independence. Native Egyptian rebellions, particularly in Upper Egypt, challenged Greek rule. The Ptolemies relied increasingly on mercenary armies rather than Egyptian troops, distrusting their own subjects. And Rome was growing. The Roman Republic, expanding eastward, conquered Macedonia, Greece, Syria. The Ptolemies watched nervously as their world was absorbed piece by piece into Rome's expanding empire. They sent embassies, paid tribute, sought alliances, tried desperately to maintain independence through diplomacy since military resistance was impossible. By the time Cleopatra VII ascended the throne in 51 BC, Egypt was the last major Hellenistic kingdom still independent. And even that independence was more fiction than fact. Egypt survived because Rome allowed it to, because it remained useful as a buffer state and source of grain. Cleopatra was 18 years old when she became pharaoh, co-ruling initially with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. She was Macedonian by ancestry but Egyptian by culture, in ways her predecessors had not been. She learned the Egyptian language, the first Ptolemaic ruler to do so. She presented herself as the new Isis, the goddess incarnate. She understood that legitimacy in Egypt required more than Greek sophistication. It required connection to the ancient traditions. But she ruled in a world dominated by Rome, and to preserve her kingdom she would need to manipulate Roman power rather than oppose it. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt pursuing his rival Pompey, Cleopatra saw opportunity. Ptolemy XIII's advisors, hoping to win Caesar's favour, murdered Pompey and presented his severed head to the Roman general. Caesar was reportedly disgusted. Pompey had been his rival, but also his former son-in-law and a fellow Roman. The murder was a miscalculation. Cleopatra acted boldly. According to legend, she had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence, rolled up in a carpet. Whether this story is true or romanticized, the meeting happened, and its consequences were profound. Caesar, 52 years old, was captivated by the 21-year-old pharaoh. Romance, politics, mutual advantage all intertwined. Caesar supported Cleopatra against her brother. Civil war erupted in Alexandria. The great library was partially burned during the fighting, an irreplaceable loss, though the extent of the damage remains debated. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile, fleeing defeat. Cleopatra became sole ruler, later marrying her younger brother Ptolemy XIV to maintain the fiction of joint rule. Though she held real power, she bore Caesar a son, Caesarion Little Caesar, whom she claimed was his heir. She travelled to Rome, living in Caesar's villa, shocking Roman society with her foreign queenly presence. The Romans, who prided themselves on republican virtues, viewed her with suspicion and fascination. Then Caesar was assassinated on the Flocino. Ides of March, 44 BC, stabbed 23 times on the Senate floor by conspirators who feared he aspired to kingship. Cleopatra fled Rome, returned to Egypt, had Ptolemy XIV killed. He was no longer useful and potentially dangerous, and declared Caesarion co-pharaoh. Rome descended into civil war. The assassins, Brutus and Cassius, faced Caesar's supporters Mark Antony and Octavian. The Roman world tore itself apart in a struggle for supremacy. Cleopatra, watching carefully, eventually allied with Mark Antony. He arrived in Egypt in 41 BC, and like Caesar before him, fell under Cleopatra's spell, though spell undersells what was actually a sophisticated political partnership. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund his campaigns. Cleopatra needed Roman military power to protect her kingdom. They became lovers. They had twins, then a third child. Antony, now married to Octavian's sister, but living in Alexandria with Cleopatra, adopted an increasingly Eastern, monarchical style that horrified Rome. At a ceremony in Alexandria, he declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings and distributed territories to their children. It looked like empire building, like a Roman general creating an Eastern dynasty that would rival Rome itself. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and Antony's rival, seized on this. He portrayed Antony as bewitched by a foreign queen, abandoning Roman virtue, planning to move the capital to Alexandria. It was propaganda, but effective propaganda. Rome, which had tolerated Caesar's affair with Cleopatra, could not tolerate Antony's apparent submission to her. War was declared not on Antony, officially, but on Cleopatra. Rome would fight Egypt, though really it was Roman fighting Roman, with Egypt caught between. The decisive battle came at Actium in 31 BC, a naval engagement off the coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra commanded a fleet of large, heavy warships, impressive but slow. Octavian's Admiral Agrippa commanded smaller, faster vessels. The battle turned into disaster for Antony. Cleopatra, seeing defeat, sailed away with her ships. Antony, abandoning his fleet, followed her. Whether this was planned retreat or panic remains debated, but the result was clear. Antony's forces surrendered, his army melted away, his allies abandoned him. The war was lost. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria, knowing Octavian would follow, knowing the end was approaching. They spent their final months in a mixture of defiance and resignation, hosting banquets, preparing for death. When Octavian's army arrived, Antony fell on his sword, or tried to. The suicide attempt was botched. He was carried, dying, to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where she had barricaded herself with her treasure. In the dramatic accounts, she had him hauled up through a window, and he died in her arms. Cleopatra negotiated with Octavian, trying to preserve something: her children's lives, her kingdom's autonomy, something. But Octavian was implacable. He would parade her through Rome in chains as a captive queen, displaying Egypt's conquest to the Roman mob. Rather than endure such humiliation, Cleopatra chose death. On the 10th of August, 30 BC, she killed herself. The method remains uncertain, tradition says an asp, a venomous snake, smuggled to her in a basket of figs. Perhaps poison, a cleaner and more certain method. She was 39 years old. She had ruled for 21 years, longer than most Ptolemies. She had borne 4 children. She had allied with the 2 most powerful Romans of her era. She had tried, with intelligence and courage and every tool at her disposal, to preserve her kingdom's independence. She failed, but her failure was inevitable. No amount of brilliance could have saved Egypt against Rome's overwhelming power. The question was never whether Egypt would fall, but how long it could delay the inevitable, and whether its last pharaoh would surrender with dignity or fight to the bitter end. Cleopatra fought. Octavian had Caesarion killed Caesar's son, could not be allowed to live as a rival claimant. He spared Cleopatra's children by Antony, parading them in his triumph but then raising them in his household. He annexed Egypt as a province of Rome, so valuable that he kept it under direct imperial control, allowing no senator to govern it. The priests of Egypt continued their rituals. The farmers continued working the fields. The Nile continued its annual flood. In many ways, daily life changed little. But the pharaohs were gone. 3,000 years of independent Egyptian civilization had ended. Octavian, soon to become Augustus Caesar, first emperor of Rome, had hieroglyphic inscriptions carved showing himself in pharaonic regalia. But he never visited the temples. He did not participate in the ancient rituals. He was not pharaoh in any meaningful sense. He was emperor, and Egypt was simply another province, valuable for its grain and wealth, but no longer special, no longer the eternal kingdom it had believed itself to be. Stand with me one final time beside the Nile. The river flows as it has always flowed, unchanged by human history. But everything else has changed. The temples still stand, but they serve a province rather than a kingdom. The pyramids still rise in the desert, but they are relics of an incomprehensible past. The hieroglyphs still cover the monuments, but already they are becoming indecipherable as the old knowledge fades. Within a few centuries, no one would be able to read the ancient script. The last hieroglyphic inscription would be carved at Philae Temple in 394 AD, over 400 years after Cleopatra's death. Then the knowledge would be lost, remaining lost for 14 centuries, until Champollion deciphered the Rosetta Stone in 1822. But the legacy endured. Egyptian civilization influenced everything that followed: Greek philosophy, Roman religion, Christian, monasticism, Islamic science, the architectural innovations, the mathematical discoveries, the administrative techniques, the artistic conventions. All these spread throughout the ancient world and shaped subsequent civilizations. And the memory endured. The pyramids could not be forgotten. The massive temples could not be ignored. Travelers from distant lands came to marvel, to wonder how such monuments were built, to feel the weight of deep time pressing down. Egypt became myth and memory, a golden age remembered, a civilization that had lasted so long that its very longevity seemed to argue for something eternal in human achievement. If Egypt could endure 3,000 years, perhaps some things truly did transcend mortality. The pharaohs are gone, the kingdom is gone, but something remains. In museums housing golden masks and painted sarcophagi, in the pyramids still standing, after 45 centuries, in the language we still use, pharaoh, paper from papyrus, chemistry from Kemet, Egypt's ancient name, in our fascination with what they achieved, in our wonder at how they lived, in our recognition that they too were human, ambitious and flawed, brilliant and limited, building what they hoped would last forever. Some of it did last, not in the way they intended, not through resurrection or divine kingship or eternal rule, but through memory, through influence, through the simple fact that what they built was too massive, too beautiful, too extraordinary to ever be completely forgotten. The sun has set over the Nile, but the light it cast still illuminates our world. Egypt's story has ended, but its echoes will never cease.